They said Reverend Daniel Granger walked away on a quiet Sunday morning. No note, no sermon. Just gone. The church bulletin still bore his name the week after. His Bible still sat on the pulpit. His keys were found on the chapel floor, arranged in the shape of a cross. Whether by grief or guilt, no one ever agreed. The cedar tree behind the chapel, the one he planted his first year as pastor, was burned to a stump by week's end. Said to be diseased. Said to be symbolic. No one asked too many questions. 25 years later, the pews are dusty, the doors swollen with rain, and the truth is buried beneath roots and silence. Until now, because someone just found what they weren't meant to find, and not everything that's buried stays dead. Please subscribe before watching. Thank you. The road to Ash Hollow hadn't changed much. The hills still curled around the valley like weary shoulders hunched against the sky. Pines lined the shoulders of Route 46, tall and patient, like old deacons watching the world pass by with folded arms. Ethan Granger kept both hands on the wheel of the rental car, knuckles pale. The town's welcome sign crept into view. Ash Hollow, founded 1872, a God-fearing community. He slowed as if the name alone might judge him. He hadn't been back in over a decade. The last time he was here, it was fall, and he was standing on a different kind of altar, fresh out of seminary, all idealism and worn theology books, watching his older brother Daniel preach to a packed congregation at Mount Cedar Chapel. That night, people had cried. They had stood and clapped for a sermon on righteousness and mercy. Ethan had clapped too, unsure then of how fragile such words could be. Now Daniel was dead. The funeral had been small, sparse even. Ethan had arrived too late to speak. An efficient service, Pastor Callum from a neighboring town officiating. Ash Hollow had moved on years ago, it seemed. The only seat saved for Ethan had been in the back. He parked in front of the chapel late in the afternoon, sun low behind the cross-shaped steeple. The building was smaller than he remembered. White paint chipped along the edges. The windows, stained glass though simple, bore years of dust. A chapel in waiting. The parsonage key had come in a plain envelope with no note. Just the key and a short line scribbled on hotel stationery. He wanted you to have it. Miriam Ethan stepped onto the chapel porch. The door creaked open without protest. Inside, the air smelled of old cedar and paper. The pulpit stood empty, and the pews were still arranged in orderly lines, though one in the back had buckled at the leg. He stood in the silence for a long moment. It wasn't reverent silence. It was the silence of something forgotten. No echo of Daniel's voice, no trace of music, just the bones of a place once alive with prayer. He turned toward the parsonage. It stood just 50 yards behind the chapel, a small house with peeling white siding and shutters hanging at angles like crooked teeth. Inside, everything had been left tidied but bare. The furniture remained, the walls were clean, and the place carried the unmistakable feeling of being emptied on purpose. Ethan dropped his bag near the door and walked the room slowly. The bedroom still held a twin bed and a narrow desk. On the desk was a single sealed envelope marked, "To Ethan." He stared at it for several seconds before picking it up. His fingers trembled slightly as he broke the seal. "Ethan, I know what they told you. I know what they told everyone. I left things undone. I didn't fight back when I should have. I thought I was doing the godly thing, staying quiet, enduring. But silence became its own kind of lie. There's a journal. It's hidden in the chapel. If you're reading this, you've come back. That means something. Don't believe what they said. Find the truth. Daniel." Ethan folded the letter slowly, deliberately. His breath had gone shallow. He sat down hard on the edge of the bed. Dust floated in the air like ashes suspended in golden light. What truth? What lie? He had left seminary in the 3rd year, not for lack of grades or faith, but for reasons he never learned how to explain. The system felt like scaffolding without a building, like sound theology taught by men who hadn't suffered. Daniel had understood, or pretended to. He had told Ethan to take his time, to come home when he was ready, but Ethan never did. And now Daniel was gone, and the town whispered that it had been scandal or shame, or maybe both. He stood and walked to the chapel once more. The doors groaned shut behind him. He moved toward the pulpit, eyes scanning for anything out of place. The wood was smooth under his hand. He checked beneath, only wiring for an old microphone. Then he saw it, a shallow groove carved into the back panel of the altar base. He knelt and pulled at it. A small panel came loose. Behind it, dark and flat against the wood, lay a square of scorched ground, a stump blackened and twisted, buried just beneath the altar's outer frame. Around it, faint traces of ash, the cedar tree. Daniel had once planted it with the congregation as a symbol of purity, integrity, unwavering truth. It had been burned, deliberately. Ethan didn't speak, he only stared. The silence in the chapel was louder now, less empty, more expectant. As he stood, something cracked beneath his foot. He reached down and picked up what looked like a fragment of charred bark. There was a faint etching on it, burned just deep enough to survive. Not consumed. It was a biblical reference. The burning bush. Moses. The presence of God. Ethan didn't know if he believed in signs anymore, but the cedar had burned, and something was waiting in the ash. The house creaked in the cold, the way old bones might after too many years without motion. That night, Ethan stayed awake longer than he meant to. The envelope and its short message still on the desk, unfolded beside a cup of untouched coffee. He had left the chapel door open when he walked back, not out of forgetfulness, but some faint, inexplicable instinct. A part of him wanted the building to breathe again, to stir, maybe even to speak, but it remained silent. Just past midnight, Ethan wandered into the kitchen and opened the back door. The air outside was sharp with spring's hesitant chill. He stood on the stoop and looked toward the dark outline of the chapel. Beyond it, he could just make out the stump behind the altar, a gnarled silhouette, blackened and low, barely a memory of what once stood. In the letter, Daniel had written there was a journal, hidden in the chapel. The idea both pulled and unnerved him. Daniel had always been methodical. If he hid something, it would be somewhere intentional. Not in a rush, not as panic, but as preparation. At dawn, Ethan returned. The chapel was even quieter in the morning. The sun poured through the eastern stained glass window, pale gold and faded blue, throwing fragments of soft color onto the altar floor. Dust swirled in the light, tiny particles suspended like time had stopped here and was unsure how to resume. Ethan searched without knowing what he was hoping to find. He began with the pulpit. It was solid oak, clean. Beneath it, he checked again. Panel, groove, wiring. Nothing else. Then the pews. Each one was identical, long benches with hymn racks and worn cushions. The third pew on the right had a small scratch etched into the side. Ethan bent down. No panel, no drawer, but something had been carved deliberately. He reached into the hymn rack. Nothing at first. Then, tucked behind a forgotten copy of the Broadman hymnal, he found a thin black notebook, the kind seminary students carried like shields in their coat pockets. No title. He opened the cover. On the inside was a simple inscription, handwritten in neat block letters. Daniel Granger, April 1st, 2012. Begin again. Ethan's breath caught. He had expected guilt, confession, maybe the outline of a scandal, but the first few pages were instead devotionals, scripture, reflections. April the 3rd, Psalm the 12:1. Help, Lord, for the godly are no more. This chapel was once a sanctuary. It is now a vault. I remain its caretaker not out of pride, but penance. Yet God does not abandon. He refines. Each entry was dated. Each was short, sparse. Daniel's writing style had always been that way. His sermons had leaned on brevity. Say less, mean more. Let the silence speak louder than the applause. As Ethan flipped ahead, the tone shifted. April 16th. The board met without me. Again. They passed a motion to withdraw benevolence funds, pending further evaluation. I asked for clarification. None was given. Later, Harold said it was nothing personal, but the budget is bleeding, and no one is asking where the blood is going. I will document everything. If I fall, let it be forward. Ethan sat back in the pew, the journal open in his lap. The pew groaned under his weight, like it too had been waiting for a body to return. Outside, the morning breeze moved through the trees. The chapel was silent again. Not dead, waiting. He turned one more page and froze. A name, George Langley, and then beneath it, misappropriated funds. Witnessed it. Miriam suspects. Silence is complicity. Ethan read it twice. George Langley had been a deacon, respected, retired from teaching. He had been kind to Ethan as a teenager, had given him a copy of Mere Christianity for his 16th birthday. Daniel had suspected him, written it down, left it behind. If this was real, it wasn't just a church scandal. It was betrayal of trust. Betrayal of the very community that claimed to follow truth. Ethan stood. The chapel suddenly felt smaller. He returned the journal to the inside pocket of his jacket, unsure if it belonged to him now, or if he was merely a keeper of it until the right moment. He moved toward the door. He stopped at the threshold. The back of the chapel, behind the altar, was where the cedar tree had once stood. Daniel had planted it after his first year as full-time pastor, a symbol of longevity and righteousness. A verse had been read from Psalm 92. The righteous will flourish like a palm tree. They will grow like a cedar of Lebanon. Ethan stepped outside and walked around the building. The stump was blackened and ringed with ash, as if someone had set fire and then walked away without putting it out. Around it, faint impressions in the earth, as if something had been buried or dug up. He knelt and brushed his fingers over the bark. The surface was brittle. A small groove was visible on the side, where a plaque might have been nailed. It was gone now. In its place, etched faintly with a blade or a nail, were 4 words. He was not silent. Ethan stood slowly, heart beating harder now. The journal, the tree, the rumor that Daniel had walked away from the church. He hadn't walked. He had been pushed, silenced. And now the silence itself was beginning to crack. By mid-afternoon, the light through the chapel windows had turned amber, slanting low and warm against the worn oak floor. Ethan sat in the second row, the journal open on his lap, the ink of Daniel's words deep and distinct even after years. Each entry was a thread, some unraveling, some binding, and all of it pointed toward a man who had not run from God, but had been left standing in a storm of silence, with only prayer and the spine of Scripture to hold him up. April 23rd. Miriam came by with groceries again. She doesn't speak of the board, but I think she knows. Her silence feels protective, not fearful. I asked her once why she still cleans the chapel. She said, "God's dust is still God's." I suppose there's a sermon in that. Ethan closed the notebook for a moment, pressing the spine with his fingers. He felt something stir in him, not clarity, not yet, but a kind of aching recognition. This was the voice of his brother, yes, but also something older, deeper, the sound of a man trying to carry faith where faith had failed him. The wind had picked up outside. He could hear it rustling through the trees behind the chapel, brushing against the broken stump. The sound was soft, but insistent, like a hand against a locked door. He stood and moved to the front of the chapel, toward the small vestry room behind the pulpit. The door opened with a soft groan. Inside, the air was cooler, and the room was lined with shelves still holding dusty communion trays, mismatched offering baskets, and 2 faded baptismal gowns. One corner had been turned into a makeshift sleeping area. A cot, a folded blanket, an old radio. Daniel had lived here toward the end. Not in the parsonage, but in the very house of worship that had exiled him. Ethan could imagine it. His brother waking up before sunrise, praying on aching knees, heating coffee on a plug-in burner, still believing in a church that had stopped believing in him. That was Daniel. He had always stayed too long in broken places. Ethan sat on the cot. His eyes fell to the floor beneath the far shelf. Something was sticking out from under a pile of choir books. A corner of fabric. He knelt, moved the books, and pulled it free. A child's sleeping bag, threadbare, pink and blue. A faded cartoon bear smiling on the front. He froze. Someone had been here recently. Suddenly, he heard movement, soft, cautious, behind him, in the chapel. He stood quickly, heart thudding, and walked out through the vestry door. The sanctuary looked empty at first. Then he saw her, a young girl, no older than 11 or 12, sitting in the third pew from the front. Her knees drawn up to her chest, dirt on her jeans, a small canvas backpack clutched in her arms. She didn't startle when she saw him. She simply stared, wide-eyed, but calm. "Hello," Ethan said, voice gentle. The girl didn't reply. "You're safe," he added, stepping closer. "This is a church." The girl glanced toward the front door, then back at him. "I know," she said finally. Her voice was soft, but clear. "That's why I came." Ethan nodded, uncertain what to do next. "My name's Ethan." She hesitated. "Rosie." He sat in the pew across the aisle, giving her space. "Rosie, do your parents know where you are?" She looked down at her shoes. "I don't have parents, not anymore." Ethan felt something twist in his chest. "Who takes care of you?" "My aunt. But she yells a lot. I don't like staying there." Her fingers gripped the strap of her bag tighter. "I came here because it's quiet." Ethan studied her. There was something raw in her voice, but not rehearsed. She hadn't run away for drama. She had run toward something. Silence, peace, maybe even God. Even children knew when a place carried safety. "This was my brother's church," Ethan said after a moment. "His name was Daniel." Rosie looked up. "The man who died?" Ethan nodded. "You knew him?" "Not really, but I saw him once. He gave me a candy after school when I was walking by. Said he liked my purple shoes." She looked down again. "I was wearing them that day." Ethan smiled, though it caught on something inside. That sounded like Daniel. Warmth in passing, grace with no audience. "Do you have anywhere else to go tonight?" She shook her head. "I was going to sleep in the back, like I did last week." Ethan thought for a long moment. He couldn't take her to the house, not without knowing more, but he couldn't leave her alone either. "I won't call anyone," he said. "Not yet, but you'll need to let me talk to someone soon. Maybe the church caretaker. Her name's Miriam. She's kind." Rosie didn't answer. She leaned her head against the pew in front of her, and for the first time, Ethan noticed how tired she looked, like someone much older than her small frame allowed. He stood. "There's some food in the parsonage. Come with me. You can eat and rest. We'll figure it out." She followed. In the kitchen, Ethan made 2 sandwiches with what little he had found at the store earlier. Rosie ate quietly, gratefully. When she finished, she asked if she could lie down on the couch. Within minutes, she was asleep. Ethan stood at the kitchen sink, staring out the window at the chapel beyond. What was happening? A hidden journal, a burned tree, a child seeking sanctuary in a place the church itself had abandoned. He took out Daniel's journal and opened to the next page. May 1st. A young girl came by the chapel today, left flowers on the steps, said she missed the singing. No one sings anymore. Perhaps silence is the last true form of worship when words lose their weight. Ethan read the passage again and looked toward the sleeping girl in the next room. He didn't believe in signs anymore, but he couldn't ignore this. Miriam Blackwood lived in a red brick cottage at the edge of Ash Hollow, a place where the grass never seemed to die, and the porch sagged just enough to suggest the weight of years well carried. Ethan had called that morning. Her number was still in Daniel's old Rolodex, labeled in faded ink. Miriam, Steward. She answered on the second ring, her voice firm and warm, the kind that held its shape even when life didn't. Daniel's brother, she said as soon as he gave his name. Well, mercy me. You sound older than you should. I feel it. I'll put on coffee, she said, and hung up. Ethan arrived an hour later, Daniel's journal tucked under his arm like a quiet question. Miriam met him at the door with a short nod and a steady gaze. She wore a wool cardigan and work boots, her silver hair pulled back in a braid that fell over one shoulder. You look more like your mother than Daniel did, she said, stepping aside. Come in. The inside of her home smelled like lemon oil and cedarwood polish. Photos lined the mantel, weddings, children, a few black and white portraits in wooden frames. She handed him a mug before he could even sit. Still take it black? She asked. Ethan hesitated. You remember that? Miriam raised an eyebrow. You were practically raised in that chapel. You think we didn't notice the way you used to sneak communion wafers during choir practice? He smiled faintly. The warmth of memory touched something colder inside him, but didn't melt it yet. She sat across from him at a small kitchen table. I suppose you're not here just for coffee. No. You found the journal? Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. You knew about it? She didn't flinch. I helped him hide it. The answer came without hesitation, as though she'd been waiting to speak it for years. He trusted you, Ethan said. He did, Miriam replied. Right up to the end. Ethan set the journal on the table, his fingers resting on the cover. Why didn't you tell anyone? After he died. Miriam leaned back, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Because no one would have listened. Not then. The board made sure of that. They buried him in silence before the ground ever did. Ethan felt a tightness in his chest. They said he left, that he walked away from the ministry, from God. Her expression hardened. They lied. She stood, walked slowly to a nearby bookshelf, and pulled down a small wooden box. From it, she retrieved an old photo, Daniel, standing beside a young, newly built cedar sapling, smiling as sunlight streamed across the churchyard. He planted that tree the year he became full pastor, Miriam said, handing him the picture. Said he wanted a reminder that truth had to take root or it'd blow away. Ethan nodded slowly. I saw the stump, burned. They cut it down the week after the board removed him, burned it on a Sunday night, said it was diseased. But we all knew better. Ethan looked at her. You were there that night. I was always there, she said quietly, cleaning up after the damage. A silence settled between them. Miriam turned to face the window. Daniel wasn't perfect, Ethan. He carried burdens none of us could see, but he didn't fail. He didn't flee. He stood in the fire. Ethan opened the journal and flipped to a bookmarked page. May 14th. They asked me to leave quietly. I refused, not because I wanted a fight, but because the silence would have been consent. I said, if I go, the tree goes with me. I thought I was speaking metaphorically. They took me literally. Miriam sat back down and stared at the page. He wrote that 3 days before they banned him from speaking, she whispered, and 2 weeks before he disappeared from town, just faded like breath in a cold room. Ethan stared at the journal, then looked up. Do you think he gave up? She met his gaze. Number. But I think he lost hope that people could hear the truth without wanting to silence the voice behind it. Outside, a breeze stirred the wind chimes on the porch. A soft, dissonant harmony drifted through the open window. Miriam reached over and gently tapped the cover of the journal. "You're not Daniel, but maybe you're meant to finish what he started." "I'm not a pastor anymore," Ethan said. "I'm not even sure I'm a believer anymore." "Then you're exactly where you need to be," Miriam replied. "God never used men who thought they were already holy." Ethan felt the words settle deep, uncomfortable in their truth. He took another sip of coffee. The warmth didn't reach his bones, but it held off the chill. As he left Miriam's house that afternoon, the sun had begun its slow descent behind the hills, casting long shadows toward the chapel. The past was reaching for him, not to pull him backward, but to point forward. Rosie was waiting on the chapel steps when he returned. She looked up from a sketch pad in her lap. "Where'd you go?" she asked. "Talking to someone who remembers things better than I do," Ethan replied. Rosie nodded and held up the sketch pad. It was a rough drawing, charcoal and smudges, but unmistakable. The chapel. And behind it, a tall, unbroken cedar tree. "I don't remember it," she said, "but I think maybe it wants to come back." Ethan looked at the drawing for a long time. "Maybe it does," he said softly. It started with a locked drawer. Ethan hadn't intended to search Daniel's old office in the chapel that morning. He just wanted to organize the shelves, dust the books, maybe set out a vase in the window. Something small to make the space breathe again. But when he moved a worn copy of The Cost of Discipleship, the desk drawer beneath it rattled, and he heard something shift inside. Locked. He searched the drawers above and below. Nothing. Then, tucked behind a row of church bulletins in a file box, he found a small silver key taped to the inside. It fit. Inside was a ledger, handwritten, careful columns, dates, donation amounts, allocations, and in the margins, Daniel's unmistakable script. Benevolence Fund redirection. No board vote recorded. $2,000 unaccounted for. George approved. Harold absent. Purpose unspecified. Urgent follow-up required. Ethan sat back slowly. He pulled out another sheet, this one more cryptic, half erased, pencil markings overwritten in ink, then smudged. But a pattern was clear. April 3rd, withdrawal April 17th, urgent need. May 5th, gift to pastoral assistants. Circled, each line ended with Daniel's small initials and the word questioned. He was building a case. Ethan flipped through the file, pulse picking up. These weren't sermon notes or administrative trivia. This was a paper trail. His brother had tried to follow the money, and then they silenced him. He closed the ledger and leaned back in the office chair, which creaked beneath him. The sun had shifted higher in the sky, casting sharp angles of light through the dusty blinds. Outside, the chapel lawn lay quiet, but the silence now felt tense, like the air before a storm. He opened Daniel's journal again. May 20th. George called the audit unnecessary. Harold said I was obsessed with control. I told them, this isn't about control, it's about stewardship. We preach against wolves and then let them count the flock. Ethan stood and paced. The voices of his seminary professors echoed dimly in memory. The church must never confuse its calling with its budget. But here, in this small town, it seemed the budget had become the calling, and Daniel had paid the price for saying so. He stared again at the final column in the ledger. $10,500. Misallocated, unexplained. The date, June 1st, 2012. The same week Daniel was removed. There were no signatures, no explanations, just silence. He set down the journal and ledger. Outside, he heard laughter, children playing on the street. The world spun on, unaware that justice had been buried under years of polite shrugs and closed doors. The phone rang in the parsonage. He answered out of reflex. "Mr. Granger?" It was a man's voice, familiar, clipped, older. Yes? This is Deputy Caleb Hines. I heard from Miriam you're back in town. I was hoping we could talk. About Daniel, Ethan asked. A pause. About the past, and how some of it won't stay buried. Caleb Hines still wore his badge like an old belt buckle. Comfortable, broken in, but not polished. He met Ethan at the town diner, a place with sun-cracked booths and a waitress who still wrote orders on carbon copy pads. You look like your brother, Caleb said, sliding into the seat across from him. I hear that a lot. Caleb nodded. You and me, we went to youth group together. You probably don't remember. I remember you tackled me in flag football and gave me a nosebleed. Caleb smiled faintly. Right, that was me. They sat in silence for a moment. The waitress poured coffee without asking. I was a young deputy when Daniel left, Caleb said finally. Still figuring out how to keep the peace without picking sides. I didn't ask enough questions. Thought it was a church thing, not a law thing. Ethan watched him carefully. What changed? Caleb pulled a slip of paper from his jacket. It was a photocopy, grainy and faint, but it showed a check. Church letterhead. Signed by George Langley. Payable to C. Hines. Amount $400. I was told it was for security consulting. Extra patrols at the chapel during the transition. But no one else ever asked for it, and the check came from the benevolence fund. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Caleb set down his mug. I didn't cash it. I knew it didn't smell right, but I also didn't blow the whistle. I convinced myself it was just a one-time thing. Years later, I'm not so sure. Ethan pulled the ledger from his bag and slid it across the table. Caleb's expression darkened as he read. He was documenting everything. Ethan nodded. He wasn't silent. He was preparing. Caleb looked up. Do you think he knew they'd try to shut him down? I think he hoped the truth would speak for itself. Caleb sighed and slid the paper back. He was wrong about that. People don't hear truth unless it costs them less than the lie. Ethan leaned back, heart pounding. So what now? Caleb's eyes sharpened. Now, we start asking questions the right way. Not as church folks, as citizens, as people who owe Daniel more than a prayer and a plaque. That evening, Ethan sat in the chapel alone. He didn't open the journal. He didn't pray. He just listened. The pews creaked faintly in the settling dusk, and the wind stirred again outside. It wasn't dramatic, but it was persistent. A sound like breath, like truth. And Ethan knew. This wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was about the kind of silence that kills, and whether anyone left had the courage to break it. The next morning, Ash Hollow was unusually bright. Sunlight poured through the parsonage window in gold sheets, catching motes of dust in the air like tiny, aimless prayers. Ethan had barely slept. He stood in front of the mirror, half-shaven, staring at a face he barely recognized. Grief hadn't aged him as much as silence had. The ledger, Daniel's journal, and Caleb's check photocopy were stacked on the kitchen table, like evidence waiting to testify. He would not let them gather dust again. Whispers started at Turner's grocery, near the feed sacks and boxes of store-brand cereal. Ethan went in for coffee filters, left with sideways glances and half-phrases offered like breadcrumbs. Saw you up at the chapel. Funny how that place gets a visitor only after someone dies. Your brother. Daniel was good, just complicated. Ethan said little, nodded where he had to. But he noticed how everyone said Daniel's name like it might shatter, gently but with distance. Outside, he ran into Janice Henley, the organist from decades ago. She walked with a cane now, but still wore her hair in the same tight bun, as if time should bend around her discipline. You're stirring things up, she said. I'm not trying to. Well, you are. Some people like things quiet, Ethan. I'm learning that. She hesitated. For what it's worth, Daniel never hurt anyone. I don't care what they said. The problem wasn't what he did. It was what he wouldn't stop asking. He paused. What was he asking? She lowered her voice. Where the money went? Who controlled it? Why the deacons kept changing the books after board meetings? Then she walked away. Later, Ethan sat on the chapel steps with Rosie. She was eating crackers and watching a beetle cross the stone walkway like it was on a pilgrimage of its own. You're quiet today, he said. She shrugged. The lady from the office came by my school. Your aunt? Number the other one. From the desk with the pamphlets. Said I've missed too many days. Said they might move me. Ethan's jaw tightened. Did she ask where you were? I told her I was at church. She smiled faintly. She didn't believe me. He said nothing. Just reached into the paper bag beside him and handed her a juice box. After a moment, Rosie asked, Did your brother like kids? Ethan nodded slowly. He loved them. He used to say children knew more about God than most pastors did. Why? Because they ask honest questions. She seemed satisfied by that. Inside, the chapel was still. Ethan stepped into the sanctuary and looked up at the pulpit. For the first time in days, he climbed the steps and stood behind it. The view hadn't changed. Pews lined up like soldiers, stained glass bleeding color onto the floor, dust thick in the corners. He pulled Daniel's journal from his coat and opened to the final entry marked with a red ribbon. June 2nd. They're voting tonight. Not on money, not on policy. On me. I've prepared a statement. If I'm allowed to speak, I'll read it. If not, this journal will be my witness. It's not about the money anymore. It's about the sickness, the soul rot that makes men believe their position is equal to God's purpose. If I leave, I won't do so in shame. I will not wear the silence they tried to give me like a robe. I will go as one who still believes. God sees. That will be enough. Ethan closed the journal with trembling hands. He could almost see Daniel there, standing in this same spot, holding those words in his palm like a flame, knowing no one wanted to feel its heat. They hadn't allowed him to speak. They'd voted behind closed doors. And the next morning, Daniel was gone. That evening, Caleb called again. We have something, he said. Ethan met him at the sheriff's substation, a plain brick building with windows too small and lights too bright. Caleb led him to a back room and laid out a folder. Inside were more financial records, copies Caleb had obtained from a quietly helpful clerk who'd once dated a member of the church board. Nothing dramatic, but enough to verify Daniel's claims. Patterns of fund withdrawals, gaps in board meeting minutes, untraceable line items labeled pastoral expenses. Ethan flipped through the papers. What now? Caleb leaned forward. We dig, quietly but thoroughly. The statute of limitations for financial fraud doesn't cover the lies or the exile, and if anything about Daniel's death turns out to be more than it appeared. He didn't finish the sentence. Ethan looked up. You think someone might have heard him? I think he disappeared too completely. Too conveniently. Ethan clenched his jaw. You still have that sermon he wrote? Caleb asked. Ethan nodded. It's in the chapel. I've read it. You should read it again, out loud, in that building, for whoever has ears to hear. That night, Ethan unlocked the front door of the chapel. The light was dim. He didn't turn on the overheads. Instead, he lit 2 small oil lamps, one on either side of the pulpit. Their glow was soft but steady, casting long shadows. He stood behind the pulpit, hands resting on the wood, and read aloud Daniel's undelivered sermon. When your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 more with you. If he still refuses, tell it to the church, not to shame, but to restore. God's truth must be spoken, even when it costs you your name, even when it costs you your place. The words echoed through the empty sanctuary. When he finished, Ethan sat on the front pew. The air was thick with quiet, but something was different now. This silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like listening. The next morning, the wind had shifted. Ethan noticed it the moment he stepped outside. The air was crisper, cleaner, the kind of wind that makes old leaves stir and forgotten things rise to the surface. Rosie sat cross-legged beneath the old stump, notebook in hand, sketching again. The image on the page was rough but clear. A chapel, whole and glowing, and beside it, a full-grown cedar tree, roots wide, branches like open arms. "I never saw it," she said without looking up, "but I keep drawing it." Ethan crouched beside her. "It stood here for 10 years. Daniel planted it the day he was ordained full pastor." She looked at the blackened stump. "Why'd they burn it?" He hesitated. "Because they didn't want to remember what it stood for." "What did it stand for?" He paused again, then answered truthfully. "Courage." That afternoon, Ethan went into town. He hadn't wanted to face the church board, or what was left of it, but after reading Daniel's sermon aloud, he felt something shift in his spirit. There was no more safety in hesitation. The door to the Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church office opened with a metallic jingle. Inside, the reception area was silent, neatly arranged. A young woman sat behind the desk, typing. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to speak with Harold Whitmore," Ethan said. "I was told he still works part-time." The receptionist narrowed her eyes slightly, as if trying to place him. "I'm Ethan Granger." She stilled. "Ah, one moment." She disappeared through the hallway. A few minutes later, Harold Whitmore appeared, older than Ethan remembered, with a trim beard and a cautious smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Ethan," he said, "it's been years." "Yes." Harold gestured toward a small meeting room. "Let's talk." The room smelled faintly of old books and coffee. Ethan sat. Harold followed, moving slower than age alone could explain. "I heard you've been at the chapel," Harold said, folding his hands on the table. "I've been staying there, cleaning it, reading Daniel's things." Harold didn't flinch, but his fingers tightened slightly. "You found his journal?" he asked. "Yes." "Then I imagine you have questions." "I do," Ethan said quietly. "Like why a cedar tree was burned, why a faithful pastor was forced into silence, why everyone I talk to remembers his disappearance like a weather forecast, expected, uncontested, moved on from." Harold leaned back. "Daniel was a complicated man. Number he was a righteous one. He asked questions about stewardship. He documented financial discrepancies. He gave the board a chance to come clean. You shut him out." Harold sighed, long and slow. "It was a tense time. The church was fragile. Donations were down. We had to make decisions quickly." Ethan stared at him. "So you silenced him for stability?" "He threatened unity," Harold said firmly. "Number he threatened corruption," Ethan said, rising from his chair. "And you let him walk into exile rather than face the truth." Harold's voice dropped. "You don't understand how close the church came to splitting." "I do," Ethan said coldly. "And you chose to save the structure instead of the soul." He walked out before Harold could answer. Back at the chapel, the sky had darkened with early evening clouds. Rosie was inside, lighting the oil lamps without being asked. She did it with reverence, her small hands cupping the glass chimneys, careful not to drop anything. Ethan watched her. "You believe God listens to kids?" she asked suddenly. "I think he listens best to kids," he said. Rosie nodded, satisfied. Then, "Are you going to plant another tree?" Ethan hesitated. "Maybe." "I think you should," she said. "Not the same place, though. That spot's for remembering, not for starting." He looked at the charred stump through the window. "You're wiser than most of this town. My mom used to say I was born listening." He smiled faintly. As Rosie turned back to her drawing, Ethan opened the back door and stepped outside. The wind caught his coat, tugging at it like an old friend pulling him towards something. He walked to the stump. The ground was dry, but disturbed. Something had moved here, something more than fire and ash. He knelt and brushed back loose soil. His fingers hit wood. Not roots, not part of the stump. A box. He dug gently, heart racing. The box was small, metal, and rusted at the corners. With effort, he lifted it free and pried it open. Inside, two things. A cassette tape labeled, "Final Sermon." June 2nd, a folded page. Daniel's handwriting again. If you're reading this, someone finally listened. This recording was made the night before they locked the pulpit. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I just told the truth. Please, don't let the tree be the last thing that speaks for me. Ethan stood slowly. He turned toward the chapel. The time for whispers was over. The cassette player was old, dust-covered and heavy, with two cracked speakers and a rewind button that stuck. Ethan found it in the chapel's storage closet, wedged between a stack of hymnals and a warped baptismal sign. He tested it once in the vestry. When the tape clicked into place and the voice emerged, Daniel's voice, Ethan froze. Not just because it was clear and unmistakable, but because of the way Daniel sounded. Calm, resolved, unbitter. Good evening. I don't know if anyone will ever hear this, but I need to speak these words, even if the walls are the only ones listening. That Sunday morning, Ethan opened the chapel doors wide. No flyers, no bulletin announcement. Just an open door and an oil lamp in the window, lit before the sun had even risen. Rosie helped him set up. She wiped the pews while he cleared the pulpit. Miriam came just after 8, bringing fresh bread and 2 jugs of coffee. I wasn't sure anyone would come, Ethan said. They will, Miriam said. There's something about truth. It echoes. By 9, the first few had arrived. Quiet, unsure, respectful. Then more, some curious, some cautious. Harold Whitmore came too, standing at the back, arms folded. Caleb arrived in uniform, seated beside the aisle with a notepad tucked in his jacket. By the time the bells struck 9:30, more than 40 people sat in the pews. The chapel hadn't held this many since Daniel's last Easter service. Ethan stood behind the pulpit. He didn't read scripture. He didn't pray. He pressed play. The tape hissed faintly, then quieted. Daniel's voice filled the room. Brothers and sisters, you may never hear this. You may never want to, but I need to say it anyway. The church cannot serve 2 masters. We cannot protect image and ignore integrity. We cannot preach trust while hiding broken stewardship. People shifted in their seats. Whispered glances passed like shadows. I was told to stop asking questions, but Jesus asked questions. He asked the rich man what he was clinging to. He asked Peter 3 times what he loved most. I asked where the money went. I asked why we were cutting ministry to fund reputation. And when no one answered, I did not leave. I stayed. I prayed. I believed. Ethan glanced at the crowd. Caleb's jaw was tight. Miriam's hands were clasped in her lap. Rosie sat on the front pew, still and watchful, her drawing notebook in her lap like a hymnal. I forgive those who silenced me, but I will not be complicit in silence. The cedar they burned. I planted it for the same reason this church was built, to be a witness, not to power, but to God. The tape clicked. Silence followed. No one moved. Then Ethan stepped forward. This was Daniel's final sermon, he said quietly. He recorded it the night before the board vote that removed him. He knew they wouldn't let him speak, so he made sure the truth had another way out. He let the words settle. Then, I'm not here to lead you. I'm not a pastor. I'm a man who failed at faith and ran from truth, but I'm also Daniel's brother. And now that I know the truth, I can't stay silent either. Someone in the back stood. Janice Henley. I remember the vote, she said. I voted no, but it didn't matter. They'd already made their decision before we sat down. Another voice. Caleb. We have evidence now. The ledgers, the journal, the tape. The board's financial misconduct, it's real, and it's going to be investigated. A murmur rippled through the room. Harold remained standing at the back, silent, his expression unreadable. Ethan spoke again. Daniel didn't ask to be a martyr. He asked to be heard, and now he has been. He turned to the pulpit and pulled out the folded page from Daniel's journal. He read it aloud. If I leave, let it be forward. Let it be toward grace, not bitterness. Let it be with the truth at my back. And let someone else, someday, plant a cedar again. Ethan stepped down from the pulpit. No applause followed, no altar call, just a stillness that felt heavier than silence and deeper than grief. After the service, people lingered. Some wept, some whispered, some simply sat in the pews like they didn't know how to leave yet. Rosie stood at the back, handing out charcoal drawings she had made. Small sketches of the chapel, the cedar tree, a man with outstretched hands. To Ethan she handed one, a tree growing out of stone. New roots, she said. Outside, Harold approached him. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Harold said, I kept that cassette in a drawer for 3 years. I knew he recorded it. I just couldn't face it. You didn't destroy it. No, Harold said, but I didn't protect it either. He looked away. I'll give a full statement to the sheriff, he added. It's past time. Ethan nodded. It is. That night, Ethan and Rosie stood outside the chapel beneath a sky scattered with stars. The stump of the old cedar lay in shadow, but something in the earth felt different now. Not forgotten, just waiting. We're planting another one, aren't we? Rosie asked. Yes, Ethan said. We are. Ash Hollow didn't erupt after the tape played. It didn't riot. No torches, no confessions screamed from rooftops. But it shifted, not like an earthquake, more like the slow, cracking thaw of winter. On Monday morning, someone scrubbed graffiti off the chapel's side wall. No one claimed credit. By Tuesday, 2 members of the old church board turned in their resignation letters at the courthouse, citing personal reflection. By Wednesday, the local paper ran a subdued editorial. We once said Reverend Daniel Granger walked away. It appears now he stood, and we simply looked the other way. Ethan kept the clipping folded in his journal, beside Rosie's drawing of the tree. He sat with Caleb again that week, this time in the sheriff's back office. The financial investigation had begun formally. Subpoenas were being issued. Witnesses were being interviewed. Some people still won't talk, Caleb said, rubbing a hand over his face. They'd rather protect an institution than face the shame. Daniel tried to stop the fire, Ethan said quietly, and they let it burn him instead. Caleb nodded. But now it's our job to rebuild with what's left. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Caleb added, There's something else. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were photocopies of Daniel's death certificate and medical examiner's notes from years ago. Records Ethan had never been shown. I thought he just disappeared, Ethan said. They found him 2 weeks later, remember? In the hills, not far from the river. They ruled it exposure. No signs of foul play, no autopsy. Ethan's eyes skimmed the notes. Daniel had been found lying against a tree. No shoes. No bag, no ID. But there were no drugs, no alcohol, no clear reason he wandered out there, Caleb said. He had packed a bag, then left it behind, like he changed his mind at the last minute. Ethan swallowed hard. You think he planned to die? I think he planned to leave, and maybe thought better of it too late. Ethan closed the folder slowly. That doesn't sound like Daniel. No, Caleb agreed. It sounds like someone who didn't want to be part of the lie anymore, but didn't know where else to go. That night, Ethan returned to the chapel alone. Rosie had gone to stay with Miriam for the weekend. Something about baking and bedtime stories and a promise of warm socks. The chapel was quiet. Ethan sat in the third pew, where Daniel used to sit before preaching. He ran his fingers along the worn wood. The room still carried his brother's presence, not like a ghost, but like memory woven into architecture. He opened the journal to the last full page, not dated, just written in long, slow lines. I kept praying God would answer, that someone would see, but maybe we aren't called to be heard. Maybe we're called to speak anyway, even if it's into the wind, even if it's under our breath, even if we burn. Ethan read the words again and again. Burning. That had become the thread. Tree, sermon, silence. Daniel hadn't fallen. He had been set on fire, in spirit if not in body, made into an emblem of what the church couldn't bear to face. And yet, something had survived. Ethan looked up. The pews, the pulpit, the girl drawing trees in the margins of grief. It had all survived. Not unscarred, but not consumed. He stood and walked outside. The cedar stump remained, dark and hollowed, but the soil around it had been disturbed by small hands. Rosie's. She had cleared the weeds, left a small ring of stones around it. A kind of altar. He knelt, pressed his palm to the earth. It was warm, not just from the sun. Ready. The next morning, Ethan visited the local nursery. He bought a young cedar, just tall enough to reach his chest, carried it back in the bed of Miriam's truck, parked beside the chapel, and left it overnight near the stump. On Sunday, they planted it together. Rosie held the roots while Ethan guided it into place. Caleb and Miriam stood nearby. Others from the town had come too, some in silence, some offering quiet prayers. When it was done, Ethan stepped back and looked at the tree. Still small, still fragile, but alive. He turned to the gathered few. My brother believed in truth, even when it cost him everything. This tree isn't just for him. It's for everyone who's ever been silenced, shut out, or burned for asking the right questions. He looked at Rosie, then at the sky, and for everyone learning to ask again. The morning after the planting, Ethan arrived at the chapel before sunrise. The cedar stood straight, dew collecting on its young needles like a baptism. He didn't bring his brother's journal that day. He didn't need it anymore. He knew the words by heart. What he carried instead was a broom, a paintbrush, and a list of small repairs scribbled on the back of a tithing envelope. There was still work to be done. By the end of the week, the chapel had begun to change. The floors had been scrubbed, the windows washed. The broken pew in the back had been braced with new wood. The smell of dust and mold gave way to cedar oil and lemon polish. Miriam's recipe. More importantly, people had started to return. Not crowds, not revivals, just a handful at first. 2 high schoolers helped sweep the lawn. A woman who once sang in the choir brought an old hymnal and left it open on the piano. Even Janice Henley, cane and all, sat in the second pew one morning and began rehearsing chords softly, as if testing whether grace might still echo from old keys. Rosie was there every day, sometimes sketching, sometimes sweeping, always watching. You're fixing everything, she said one afternoon, as Ethan patched a hole in the side door. Trying, he said. Are you staying? The question hit harder than he expected. He hadn't answered it for himself. That evening, Ethan walked the perimeter of the chapel grounds. The air smelled like spring and rain. The newly planted cedars swayed gently in the breeze, as if nodding in rhythm to a hymn no one was singing yet. Back inside, he lit the oil lamps and stood in front of the pulpit. He placed both hands on the wood and closed his eyes. What now? He wasn't a preacher. Not anymore. But something in him ached. Not for attention or sermons, but for a space where the truth could breathe again. He sat in the third pew, the one where Rosie always chose to sit, and opened a blank notebook. Not a journal, not a sermon, just a page. And he began to write. Day 1. This isn't a new church. It's an old wound, reopening. But that's where healing begins. The next morning, he met Miriam at the market. I think it's time, he told her. For what? For a Sunday service. Her eyes softened. Will you preach? Ethan shook his head. Not yet, but I'll speak, and we'll listen, and maybe that's enough to begin. On Sunday they gathered again. This time the pews were half filled. Not bad for a chapel that had once echoed with nothing but wind. Ethan stood at the front. No robe, no pulpit Bible, just a notebook and a voice still learning how to speak again. I'm not here to replace my brother, he said. I'm here because I finally understand him. He looked out at the faces, some familiar, some hesitant. You were told he abandoned this place, that he lost his way, that he quit, but I've read his words. I've walked where he walked. I've wept over the same questions, and I'm telling you now, he didn't fall. He paused. He stood, and it's time we did too. He opened the notebook. Not to preach, to read. He shared one of Daniel's final reflections. Not a sermon, but a prayer. Lord, let me not be remembered for leaving, but for standing as long as I could. And if I am forgotten, let the truth remain. Not my name, yours. When he finished, the room was silent. Then Rosie stood, small and bright in the aisle, and walked to the front. She held up a new drawing, this one of Daniel, planting the cedar, and behind him, a crowd gathering. It wasn't perfect. The lines were crooked. The faces weren't clear. But the message was, the truth had roots again. The sky turned silver on the morning of the rededication, the kind of morning that held its breath, waiting. The grass around the new cedar was damp but upright, the sapling swaying lightly as if blessing the wind. Inside the chapel, every pew had been dusted. Hymnals had been returned to the racks. A new wooden cross, simple and unvarnished, had been mounted behind the pulpit. Ethan and Miriam had agreed. There would be no banners, no flower arrangements, no staged applause. This service wasn't about celebration. It was about truth. An hour before the service, Deputy Caleb Hines stepped into the chapel, hat in hand. His face looked paler than usual, and when Ethan greeted him at the back, Caleb didn't return the smile. We found something, Caleb said. Up at the cemetery. Ethan froze. What kind of something? Evidence. Buried. They stepped outside, walking briskly toward the police truck parked beneath a maple tree. We were following up on an anonymous tip, Caleb said. A grave behind the chapel, one we thought was for a church dog. He didn't need to say more. Ethan remembered it now. The unmarked mound behind the old cedar's roots. Daniel had once joked it was the quietest deacon in the church. But what they'd found wasn't animal remains. It was a cloth-wrapped box, sealed in oilskin. Inside were Daniel's missing 1977 sermon notebook, marked Final Weeks, May-June. The original financial ledgers with handwritten corrections matching Daniel's own journal notes, a cassette tape labeled only with a date, June 2nd, 1977. They buried it, Caleb said. Same week he was removed. Ethan stared at the evidence, heart pounding. They buried the voice of the church. Caleb nodded, but not deep enough. The chapel was full by mid-morning. Miriam stood near the entry with a basket of charcoal sketches, Rosie's artwork. Small handouts of the cedar tree in various stages of growth. Most attendees took one. Rosie stood near the front, looking small in her yellow dress but unshaken. When Ethan asked earlier if she was nervous, she only said, I'm not reading for them. I'm reading for your brother. The oil lamps were lit. The organ played softly. Janice at the keys, uncertain, but steady. When Ethan stepped behind the pulpit, the crowd fell quiet. He held Daniel's recovered sermon notebook in his hands. "I want to read something," he said. "These are Daniel's final written sermons, recovered just this week." He opened to a page titled, "The Courage to Confront Evil with Love." We are not called to expose sin in anger, but to hold up truth in love. When we confront corruption in the church, we do not do so to destroy the body, but to cleanse it. If we are silent, we participate. If we speak with grace, we honor God. Ethan closed the notebook and placed it gently on the pulpit. We buried more than a man in this town. We buried a voice, a warning, a witness. He looked out over the congregation, his gaze steady. But the ground doesn't keep everything. Some seeds push back. He gestured toward the cedar tree outside the chapel window. A new one stands now, a living reminder that truth might burn, but it is not consumed. Then he stepped back. Rosie walked forward, her shoes quiet on the wooden floor. She stood on a small step behind the lectern, a Bible open in her hands. Her voice, when she read, was soft and certain. Isaiah 58:12. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. She paused, then looking up. That's what Daniel was, and what we still can be. Silence followed. Then a quiet, "Amen," from the back. Another voice repeated it, and then many. No applause, just the sound of agreement. Later, after the chapel emptied, Ethan remained behind. He sat on the front pew, notebook open, pen in hand. Not writing sermons, just thoughts. Then he heard someone step inside. Harold Whitmore. No longer the board's voice, just an old man carrying the weight of omission. He walked down the center aisle and sat in the pew behind Ethan. Said nothing for a long time. Then, I gave them the location of the grave. Ethan turned. "I told myself I was protecting the church," Harold said, "but I was really protecting myself. From shame, from the truth." Ethan studied him. "Why now?" "Because God doesn't let things stay buried forever." They sat in silence. Then Harold said, "Your brother forgave me." I read it in the journal. Even before I confessed, he wrote, "They were afraid. Not evil, just afraid." Ethan nodded slowly. "He believed in grace," he said. "So do you," Harold replied, standing to leave. "I see it now." He walked out without another word. That night, Ethan placed Daniel's final notebook and the recovered tape in a locked display case in the chapel's small library, beside a brass plaque that read, "Let the truth be spoken, even if only the walls are listening." The cedar swayed outside in the starlight, the wind passing through it like breath. The memorial service wasn't advertised. It didn't need to be. Word spread the way holy things do, quietly, reverently, from heart to heart, not headline to headline. By the time Ethan stepped up to the small outdoor altar near the cedar tree, over 60 people had gathered. Not because the town was healed, but because it had finally begun to grieve honestly. A wooden box had been placed at the foot of the sapling. Inside were the ashes recovered from Daniel's old gravesite, properly identified now through testing, confirmed by every line of evidence. It had taken months, but the state's investigation concluded the truth. Daniel Granger died alone, not by suicide, not by disgrace, but by isolation, spiritual and social, imposed by a system that feared what he saw too clearly. Harold had confessed in full. George Langley, too. The legal system would handle what came next. But this moment, here in the dirt and cedar-scented air, was about more than judgment. It was about remembrance. Ethan stood beside the box. He didn't wear black, just a buttoned shirt, sleeves rolled, palms open. A man not looking to perform, just to speak. "My brother loved this church," he began. "Not the walls, not the pulpit, not the choir loft. The people he looked at them, some with heads bowed, some holding hands, some quietly crying. He believed that the church could still be beautiful, even when it was broken. That grace was not a mask for sin, but the cure for it. That silence, when it hides truth, is not humility. It's fear. Ethan's voice cracked. He didn't stop. Daniel died without applause, without vindication, but not without hope. He turned to the cedar. We plant this tree over his resting place, not to forget what happened, but to remember why he stayed. He stepped back. Rosie approached, holding a small pitcher of water. Together they poured it into the base of the cedar's roots. The earth darkened, as if drinking, as if responding. Then Miriam stepped forward, hymn book in hand. She began to sing, soft, cracked, true. Great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father, there is no shadow of turning with thee. Others joined, a few at first, then many. The wind passed through the branches above them, and for the first time in decades, it sounded like breath again. Later that day, after everyone had gone, Ethan remained. He sat on the chapel steps, watching the sky soften with evening. The cedar cast a longer shadow now, a living memorial, not to death, but to endurance. Rosie sat beside him, eating a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "Are you going to stay here forever?" she asked. He smiled. "Forever's a long time." "Okay, but are you going to stay long enough to fix the leaky roof?" He laughed quietly. "Yes, that I can do." They sat in silence for a moment. Then she asked, "Will you preach again?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked toward the chapel. Not pristine, not full, but open. "I'm not sure," he said. "But I'll keep the doors open. I'll protect the truth. I'll tell the story." Rosie nodded. "That's kind of like preaching." Ethan thought about it. "Yes," he said. "Yes, it is." As the sun set behind the Ozark Ridge, casting gold through the old stained glass, Ethan stood. He walked back into the chapel, not as a visitor this time, not as a mourner, but as a keeper of something sacred. Not the structure, not the sermons, but the fire that had refused to go out. 6 months later, the cedar stood taller. Not much, but enough to catch the light differently. Enough for the townspeople to notice when they passed by. They had started calling it Daniel's tree, though no one had ever declared it officially. Some names grow like roots, quiet but lasting. The chapel had changed too. The pews weren't full, but they were never empty. Sunday gatherings were smaller, more honest. No bulletins, no stagecraft. Just scripture, reflection, music when someone felt brave enough to play. Ethan never took the title of pastor, but he had become something else, a custodian of integrity, a keeper of breath. That morning he unlocked the chapel and stepped into the quiet. Rosie had beat him there. Again. She was wiping dust from the windowsills with a cloth and a look of deep concentration. "Morning," she said without turning. "You're getting tall," Ethan said. "That's what trees do," she replied. He smiled. She pointed to the shelf behind the pulpit. "Did you bring it?" "I did." Ethan reached into his bag and pulled out Daniel's final notebook, the one recovered from the box, wrapped in oilskin, the cover still faintly stained from years underground. He walked it to the chapel's small library and opened the glass case where they'd placed Daniel's other journals. He laid this final one gently on top, beneath the plaque. "Let the truth be spoken, even if only the walls are listening." Rosie came beside him. "Will you read it to me sometime?" Ethan nodded. "I will." "Even the hard parts?" "Especially the hard parts." She thought about that, then asked, "Do you think Daniel's in heaven?" Ethan looked at her, and the answer came without hesitation. "Yes, because he was faithful, even when no one saw." Rosie smiled. "Then I want to be like him." "Except louder." Ethan chuckled. The world probably needs that. Before the service, Ethan stepped outside. The sky was full of light, the kind that bathes everything in stillness before the noise begins. He walked to the cedar, laid a hand on its trunk, and bowed his head. No speech, no prayer. Just breathe. And in that moment, he understood something he hadn't been ready to believe 6 months ago. God had not forgotten them. Not Daniel, not the church, not even him. He looked up at the tree and whispered, "Not consumed." Then he turned back toward the chapel and opened the doors.